Good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Farah Nayeri. I'm a journalist based in London, and I cover culture for the New York Times. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my colleague, Rukmini Callimachi, who is a correspondent for the New York Times, covering ISIS, also known as Islamic State, also known as Daesh, and al-Qaeda. Rukmini is a four-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. She is also, as you probably all know, or many of you know, she is also of Romanian origin. She was born in Romania, and I believe she left when she was about 5 years old, went to Switzerland, and then to the United States. Rukmini has spent a lot of time in the last few years, not weeks, speaking with terrorists, both in encrypted chat rooms and in the prisons where they happen to be, in prison interviews all over the world. And if I understood correctly, she sometimes also DMs terrorists. So, not a lot of us can claim to do that. That's a very, very exceptional kind of thing to do. I will pass the microphone on to Rukmini and welcome her to the stage, and then I will be back after her presentation for a Q&A. I'll ask one or two questions and then hand it over to you. So please do prepare some questions for Rukmini. Rukmini Callimachi.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Farah. 2 years ago, I got a tip from a source telling me that a member of ISIS, who was originally from Canada, who had gone to Syria to fight for the terrorist group, had somehow managed to pass through airport security in Toronto and was allegedly back in the general population without the knowledge of authorities somewhere in Canada. This in and of itself was stunning. Only about a few hundred people from North America, from Canada and America, have gone to actually join the terrorist group and fight for them in Syria and Iraq. Of those, the majority were killed on the battlefield in drone strikes, etc. And only a very small fraction have made it back to their home countries in America and Canada. And of those that have made it back, the majority are in jail. As a journalist who covers ISIS, for me this was an unprecedented opportunity. I was able to find this young man's email address, and I wrote him asking if I could interview him. I expected him to either blow me off or to say no. To my surprise, he wrote back a few days later and said, sure, come to Canada. And a few days after that, I found myself in Canada, in a hotel room with my colleague Andy Mills, waiting for an ISIS member to walk through the door. I wanted to play to you one clip from my podcast, Caliphate, which explains what happened next.
Test. That's good.
So the next step is you and I, booked a ticket.
Do you think it would throw off the feng shui if you sat here?
And we flew to Canada. We're not going to say where we went.
The microphone faces this way, and you're projecting your voice this way.
We set up ourselves in this hotel room. I texted him the name of the hotel, the address, the room number, and he agreed to come after the end of his workday, because he was working, I believe, at a restaurant. And then we started to wait. And he was initially late by 15 minutes, then 20 minutes, then 30 minutes.
We're still waiting.
He says rush hour. I'm texting him and wondering if we're going to be, stood up.
About an hour now has gone by.
At a certain point, I almost gave up. I thought, this is it. We've basically just thrown away a plane ticket to Canada. And at some point, I remember that you turned around to ask me, do you think there's any chance that this person is dangerous?
So back to the hotel, we were there for 2 hours?
Yeah. And then suddenly, out of the blue, there was a knock at the door of our hotel room. And I was shocked because I had expected him to go to the lobby and that the lobby would call us, but instead he had managed to walk past the lobby. How are you doing? Thank you for coming. happening? We were getting a tad nervous. We're like, oh my God.
Traffic is at this like peak hour too.
Yeah. And I opened the door, and he had a hoodie on. And the hoodie was pulled so far forward that I could barely see his face. His face was in shadow. And he kept it kind of pulled down like that for some time. The man who came to see us that night asked to be called Huzaifa, a code name, a nom de guerre. And in the course of the hours that he spent with me and with my colleague Andy, he confessed on tape, in great detail and with great emotion, to having killed at least 2 people at ISIS's command. If this person was telling the truth, we had met alone with a murderer in a hotel room late at night. People often ask me, why do you do this? Why do you take these risks? And I'm here to tell you that I was in that hotel room because I firmly believe in speaking to the enemy. I believe in listening to them, which is different from believing them. I believe in trying to understand them, which is different from giving them a platform. And I do this in the interest of reporting the most accurate version of events that I can. In short, I do this in the interest of truth. I began covering ISIS 5 years ago. And since then, I've received my share of threats from the group, just as do colleagues of mine who cover this entity. By now, the FBI has contacted me and my editors 6 times to warn us of what they considered to be credible threats against me or against my family. I wanted to play for you the recording of one voicemail that the FBI recently left me. And just as an aside, I realize that my name is complicated, but it is pronounced Rukmini Callimachi.
Hello, Ms. Callimachi. This is Special Agent Angus McLaughlin with the New York FBI. I was just calling to inform you that in one of our checks we saw that there was a Telegram user that posted your Twitter link regarding archiving of records, ISIS records, and they posted a comment that we should not let this pawn get away with this, and we should slaughter her and teach journalists alike a lesson. I know from looking at our records that you've gotten these duty to warn before based on your position and the line of work that you do, but it's our duty when we come across this stuff to let you know.
We should slaughter her and teach journalists like her a lesson. Yesterday, a young woman at Unfinished, here in the audience, asked me why these risks are worth it and why do I keep doing this work. I believe that the work is worth it because in the end, the war on terror is one of the most important stories of our age. To date, it has cost the United States, my country, trillions of dollars. It has cost partner nations, Romania included, much more. And it has cost thousands upon thousands of lives, not just of coalition soldiers, but of Iraqi and Syrian and Yemeni and Libyan civilians that have been killed in the crossfire. And what I've learned on this beat is that there's an unbelievable amount of misinformation. Why is there so much misinformation? I believe that one of the reasons that there is so much is that this is the only beat that I know of, the only beat that I can think of, where reporters routinely, and as a matter of course, speak to only one side of the equation, one side of the issue. We speak to government officials, we speak to people at the State Department, we seek out diplomats and ambassadors around the world, but most coverage of ISIS doesn't even try to reach the other side. And that's because the other side, in the case of ISIS, is what we see as the worst people in the world. People who have carried out crimes that are so horrific that they are akin to monsters. So speaking to the other side is essentially an exercise in speaking to monsters. I wanted to describe for you, however, my personal journey, which convinced me that the only accurate way to report on this group is by also seeking their perspective, by trying to get in contact with them, by, in short, speaking to the enemy. I began my career as a foreign correspondent in 2006 when I was appointed the West Africa Bureau Chief for the AP. I went on to become, the West Africa correspondent for the AP, and I went on to become the Bureau Chief a few years later. I was responsible for an enormous stretch of territory all the way from Mauritania in the north, all the way to Congo in Central Africa. And one of the countries on my beat was the country of Mali. In 2012, a group that was calling itself al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, so it had the al-Qaeda name in the title, managed in a matter of weeks to take over the entire northern half of the nation of Mali. When I went to my computer and I did the math, the area that they controlled in such a short period of time was equal in size to the entire territory of Afghanistan. The jihadists came in convoys of SUVs. They took over cities and villages. They opened an Islamic tribunal. Women who didn't cover up were flogged. Thieves had their hands cut off. They began exacting taxes. They changed the laws. And they began administering this territory according to their bizarre way of life. I did my best to report the story, but the problem was that I couldn't go there. It was too dangerous to be on the ground. And so I covered it much like every other reporter, meaning that I called officials, mostly in Washington. I requested meetings at the State Department. I called sources at the Pentagon. I went to see the political attaché and the defense attaché at the various Western embassies, both in Mali and in surrounding nations. And based on what these people told me, and these people, I have to say, sounded very sure of themselves and were people in positions of authority. Based on what these people told me, I developed a view of the terror group that I later learned was not just flawed, but flat out wrong. You see, I started on this beat in the year 2012. 2011, in May of that year, was when Osama bin Laden was killed in a raid by special forces in Pakistan. 2012 was an election year. It was the year when President Obama was re-elected, and the death of Osama bin Laden was being touted as the biggest foreign policy success of that administration. So the narrative that was being pushed out by officials in Washington was the following. They were saying that Osama bin Laden was like the head of the snake. The head of the snake had been cut off and the body had just withered with it. They were saying that al-Qaeda had been decimated, that its members were on the run, and that these little groups around the world that carried the al-Qaeda name, like the one that I was covering in Mali, were in fact just groups that had opportunistically taken the al-Qaeda name. They said that there was no connective tissue between groups like the one that I was covering and the central organization based in Pakistan, Afghanistan. There was no command and control, they said. Okay, that seemed to make sense. I didn't have any reason to disagree with them. So this was the worldview that I accepted and that was reflected in the reports and stories that I put out in 2012. Everything changed for me in the first weeks of 2013. The terror group, which had been holding the north of the country, suddenly, from one day to the next, decided to move south. There was a worry that even more of Mali could fall, including its capital. And within 24 to 48 hours, French forces, at the request of the Malian government, agreed to come into Mali with ground troops to try to push the jihadists back. I, like other reporters, followed behind these French troops, and we reached the city of Timbuktu 3 days after it was liberated. By the way, hands up if you knew that Timbuktu is a real place. Yeah? Okay. I get this question all the time. Yes, Timbuktu is a real place. It's a very famous city in Africa, one of the most historic, in fact. And perhaps for that reason, it was chosen as the capital of the mini emirate that al-Qaeda was trying to create in this area. Or I should say, the group that was carrying the al-Qaeda name was trying to create. Once I got to Timbuktu, residents that had been living there under this al-Qaeda named group began pointing out for me the buildings that had been occupied by the jihadists. They took me to a bank, which had been, they said, the seat of the Islamic police. They took me to one of the city's best hotels that had been turned into an Islamic tribunal. They took me to the former tax office, which was another administrative office, and so on. And to my surprise, I found that in these buildings, the group had left thousands and thousands of pages of their internal documents. I went to the pharmacy, I bought trash bags and plastic gloves, and I went building to building to pick up these documents. In fact, they began calling me the trash lady of Timbuktu. And it's in translating these documents that I learned that my government had been deceiving me. Now remember, the US government was telling reporters that would listen that this group in Mali had opportunistically taken the al-Qaeda name, that they had taken it, that they were basically just criminals and thugs, and that they had taken this grandiose name of a famous terrorist group essentially to scare people, but that there was no real connection, no real relationship between the group there and the central al-Qaeda organization. But in the third building that I searched, I found this letter here. This is one page of a multi-page letter, and I found two of them from the following person. It was signed by a man named Nasser al-Wahishi. Who's Nasser al-Wahishi? Nasser al-Wahishi was none other than the former personal secretary of Osama bin Laden. And in 2012, which is when that letter that I found was dated, he had risen to the rank of the general manager of the entire al-Qaeda organization. He was basically, in a way, the acting CEO of al-Qaeda. He was considered so important that the State Department had put out a $10 million reward for information leading to his capture. And here I was, holding two letters from this man, in which he was giving not just detailed instructions, granular instructions to the guys in Mali about how to run the territory they had controlled. One piece of advice that I remember from this letter is he told the jihadists in Mali, make sure to watch out for power cuts, for electricity cuts. Why? Because people get very upset in the heat if there's power cuts and you can't have a fan. So make sure to watch that area and avoid power cuts at all costs. So while Washington was telling reporters that there was no connection, here I was holding a letter where the command and control relationship was abundantly clear. Up until that point, I had also assumed that these guys in Mali were really just a bunch of guys in a cave. I saw them as primitive, I saw them as backwards, and I saw them as very different from myself. One of the other things that I learned from the cache that I recovered in Mali was that this is a group that is highly organized. It's so organized that in some ways it actually resembles a corporation. To show that to you, I'm going to share with you this letter here. This is one of 10 pages of a letter that was written by the al-Qaeda leadership in Africa, they're based in North Africa, to this man here, Mukhtar Belmokhtar. He's considered really the most famous terrorist in Africa. He's got a $5 million reward on his head. What was al-Qaeda writing to this guy about? It was in fact a disciplinary letter. It was a letter where they were airing grievances that had gone back years and years, a series of things that this guy had done that had really pissed off al-Qaeda. And among the things that really pissed off al-Qaeda is the fact that he failed month after month to turn in his expense reports on time. I'm not kidding, okay? He didn't turn in his expense reports on time. And that was when I translated this letter, I ended up going back with my translator to a series of buildings in Timbuktu, and we found the office of the al-Qaeda accountant. And we found how they were basically taking receipts from fighters, turning them into monthly reports that were then forwarded to their superiors to basically account for the cash advances that these terrorists were taking in order to carry out their operations, not unlike a foreign correspondent at the New York Times who has to do an Excel spreadsheet and turn in, or a PeopleSoft expense report in order to justify the amount of money that they took for a recent trip. I found these documents in early 2013, and they changed the course of my professional life. I spent a year translating and analyzing them, and with each new discovery, I realized that a much more interesting, a much more revealing way to report on al-Qaeda and later ISIS was through the group itself. Not through officials. I do talk to officials, I speak to lots of them, but not just through officials. Through the documents that the group leaves behind, and later on, through members of the group that I succeeded in speaking to. In 2014, I was hired to cover al-Qaeda at the New York Times. That same year, al-Qaeda and ISIS split, and very soon ISIS became my main preoccupation. By taking this approach, I think I've been able to dispel several of the misconceptions that I believe we have of the terror group. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples. In 2014, as you might know, ISIS swept across Iraq and Syria. They seized a territory that was the size of Great Britain, and they declared it a state. And pretty soon thereafter, pretty much every publication, mine included, began referring to that project as ISIS's so-called state, in quotes. We called it a so-called state for a number of reasons, primarily because I think we couldn't accept and we couldn't allow ourselves to believe that a terrorist group was capable of running a government. I knew from the work that I'd done in Mali that if ISIS was indeed trying to run a state, then they had a bureaucracy behind it. And if there was a bureaucracy behind it, that produces paperwork. So starting in 2015, I began embedding with Iraqi troops and later with Syrian rebels who were fighting to take back territory from ISIS. By the way, this is one of many beautiful images by my colleague Ivor Prickett, who spent a lot of time in Mosul in the same period that I was there. It was a lot harder going than Mali. The terrain was more dangerous. There were landmines, there were snipers, there were mortars being fired at us, and we spent a lot of time and lost a lot of time trying to figure out how we could safely approach this area. My goal was to be with the forces as they were taking back building by building so that I could be there before the documents inside were destroyed, because we later learned that Iraqi forces were mostly just burning the documents that were inside these buildings. I found nothing in all of 2015, and I found nothing in most of 2016, and I had almost given up until December 16th. Suddenly, things shifted for me. And I finally got access to buildings like this one that were literally full of documents. They were littering the floor, quite literally. Over 5 different trips to the region, I was able to amass a trove of 15,000 pages of ISIS's internal documents. These are documents that were never meant for public consumption. These are not propaganda records. These are letters between commanders, receipts that they issued for things that they had bought, memos to each other, disciplinary letters similar to the ones I had found in Mali. And I collected these with the permission of the Iraqi and the Syrian troops who were embedding me. I wanted to show you the detailed bureaucracy and administration that is evident through the records that I found. This is a birth certificate issued by ISIS for a little girl who was born in 2016. Here's a translation of it. The little girl was born in 2016. She was 4 kilograms at birth. It has the name of her mother and father and of the medical attendant who signed off on the certificate. What's interesting is that it has a serial number in the 4,000s, and it's signed by something called the Islamic State's Ministry of Health. Here's another one. This is a health certificate, a medical certificate for a little girl that was required. It was a medical examination that ISIS required children to undergo before they could enter an ISIS-run school in the territory that they held. Here's a translation of the first page, and it involves a little girl. She was 6 at the time that she did this examination. And here on the second page is a translation of the various tests that she had to go through. I realize that the writing is faint, but they tested her eyesight. They tested her ability to hear and her ability to talk. I don't know if you can see towards the top of the page, there's a line that says, X mark, vaccinations complete. They were checking to see if children in this ISIS-held territory had had their shots. And just in a tongue-in-cheek way, I guess I'll include this slide about a little boy who got tetanus in America because his parents refused to vaccinate him as a part of the anti-vaxxer movement. I guess we agree that ISIS is a brutal terrorist group, but somehow even they know to vaccinate their kids. Here's a few more. This is a textbook from ISIS's Ministry of Education. This is the English textbook. We had fun looking at the vocabulary page, where at the top you can see that A is for apple, and if you go to the bottom, B is for bomb. Lest we forget that this is a terrorist group. I'll ask you, I have just shown you documents from ISIS's Ministry of Health and from ISIS's Ministry of Education. How many ministries do you think that ISIS created in the 5 years, roughly, that they ran territory in Iraq and Syria? 15, did I hear? Esther Perel, of course, is right on the ball. Very close. It was 14, actually. 14 is what they declared in a video that they put out on the one-year anniversary of their statehood project. They said they had created 14 ministries. And I remember when that video landed in my inbox and I took a look at it. And I remember myself, even though I studied this, being skeptical of that. You know, it seemed like they were trying to impress us. How could this terror group possibly run 14 ministries? But I'll tell you, after I had the documents that I found translated, we realized that we had stationery, letterhead, like what I just showed you, from 11 of those 14 ministries. When I checked with scholars who look at ISIS, we found the 3 missing ministries that I did not have. So we found paperwork from all 14, meaning at some level, all 14 of those ministries were functioning. Some of the more eerie interviews that I did with civilians in Iraq and in Syria were interviews where they confided in me and said that even though they disagreed with the violence of the Islamic State, and even though some of them had personally suffered at the hands of the Islamic State, they were embarrassed to admit that in some limited ways, and I want to underline, in some limited ways, ISIS outdid the Iraqi and Syrian governments that they had usurped. For example, in Mosul, trash pickup, garbage removal, was much better under ISIS than it had been under the Iraqi state. Water, electricity, these very basics of life were somehow better under this terrorist group than under the internationally recognized government that they had overtaken. If we look at the definition of a state, one definition is a nation or territory considered as an organized political community under one government. By that definition, ISIS definitely ran its own state. It wasn't a state that was recognized by anyone other than themselves, but it was functioning as an organized political community under one government. Nothing I've said should detract from the fact that this is a brutal terrorist organization. But the thing I learned is that being brutal and being efficient and organized are not exclusive. And just as I saw in Mali, our tendency with ISIS has been to discount them, to underestimate them, to make them look smaller than they really are. I think this makes us feel better about our efforts against this group. But in fact, I don't think this helps us in the war on terror. It's like a fog that causes us to be blinded to the reality on the ground. This is why I think it's not just important, but crucial to seek out the terror group itself, in its own words. Because we learn things that the vast majority of officials in Washington, and perhaps in Bucharest, and Paris, and other world capitals, either do not know or do not wish to acknowledge. For me, the documents that I showed you are the gold standard for how to do this work. Again, these are internal documents that were never meant for public consumption. They're not trying to brag to the outside world. They're communicating amongst each other. So I think there's a level of authenticity there. But in addition to the documents they've left behind, I've worked very hard to try to speak to them, and to try to speak to them in person. In 2012 and 2013, I first started doing this online. But the problem with speaking to people online is that they're hiding behind an alias. And it's very hard when people are not telling you their real name and are not showing you the real picture. It's very hard to ascertain if they are really the person that they say they are. So starting in 2014, when I joined the Times, I began to make an effort to see if I could reach out to them and to see if there was a way to safely meet them in person. Remember this guy, Nasser al-Wahishi? Yep. This is the guy whose letter I found in Mali, the general manager of al-Qaeda. So online, by chance, in late 2014, I was able to make contact with a man who claimed to be one of the press attachés. He literally called himself that, the press attaché of Nasser al-Wahishi. It took months and months and months for me to confirm that that man was who he said he was, and it took even longer to try to gain his trust. But when I did, I asked him, do you think that there's any way, any universe in which you would accept me, a reporter for the New York Times, to come to Yemen, which is where this guy was based, to meet Wahishi for what would have been his first interview with a Western outlet? There was a back and forth, and he said, write a letter and explain to me what you want to do, and I will make sure that he sees it. He referred to Wahishi, whose code name, whose nom de guerre is Abu Basir, as the Sheikh. So I went ahead and drafted a letter on New York Times letterhead, and I have to say that this is one of the more bizarre conversations I had with my editors, where we sat around for about an hour discussing whether it would be appropriate for me as a New York Times reporter to refer to this guy as a sheikh, because that is, a term of respect. We decided no, that we would not call him sheikh, we would just call him Dear Abu Basir, and then we tried to lay out the reason why we thought that this would be both in his interest and ours. And again, the argument was to better understand these events and in the interest of truth. Through the intermediary I was using, we learned that Waheshi had received my letter. He sat on it for some time, and then he came back to me one day, the intermediary, and he sent me a message on one of the encrypted apps that we use to communicate, and he said, "The Sheikh has accepted your request. He will be in touch soon regarding the security precautions that you will need to agree to in order to come to see him." Now let me be very clear, and since my mom is in the room, I want to underline this. I doubt very much that the New York Times would have allowed me to go to Yemen to interview the general manager of al-Qaeda, regardless of the security precautions that he might have invited me to take. That's because this particular wing of al-Qaeda has been actively involved in kidnapping foreigners, so it would have been something that my newspaper most likely would not have risked. But we never got to the next step. That's because roughly a few weeks after he agreed to my interview, at least in theory, Nasser al-Waheshi was killed in a drone strike. I've now had 4 of my sources killed in Western drone strikes. And I share that to give you a sense of just how hard this work is. You do so much legwork just to identify these people, just to find a way to communicate with them. And then you do so much more legwork to convince them that as an American and as a woman, that they should trust me. And then from one day to the next, they're gone. To me, these people are like a window into this unseen world. And I keep on looking for ways to speak to them, for avenues to get to them. And that brings me to that hotel room in Canada. By now, I've interviewed more than 50 members of ISIS, but the vast majority of those interviews were conducted in jails around the world, in Iraq, in Syria, in Europe, in Tajikistan, etc. When you do an interview with a terrorist in jail, there is always the question of coercion. Even though I'm telling them, quite frankly, you don't have to answer my questions, I never know, are they under some sort of pressure to answer my questions, and therefore, does that taint the interview? It's exceedingly rare to be able to have access to a member of ISIS who is essentially in nature, if you will, who has returned to his home, especially in the West, and who's able to be interviewed in a setting where they are free to speak to me without any coercion at all, without any hint that there was a pressured environment around it. And that's why I had to go to Canada when the chance arose. It was the fall of 2016, and by some stroke of luck, we got to that hotel room after Huzaifa had returned from Syria, and less than 12 hours before Canadian intelligence came and banged down his door. That created an unbelievable opening. He had defected from ISIS, and he felt what he said was enormous guilt about what he had done as a fighter for them. He'd also managed to come home to Canada, and he had gotten through the Toronto International Airport where he thought he was going to get caught. And so I think he thought that he had slipped through the cracks, that he was not going to face any penalties for what he had done. And I think for that reason, he agreed to open up to me. I wanted to share with you just one last clip that points to the things we can learn if we just take the time to listen to these people. When we see the horrific images that ISIS puts out, the execution videos, the torture, the beheadings, the impression you get is that these are young men who are sadists, that they're serial killers, that they enjoy being cruel and inflicting pain, that they even enjoy taking human life. What Huzaifa did in the course of the hours we spent with him is he described the numerous mental steps he had to go through before he was able to kill on the orders of this terrorist group. And what was apparent to me is that it was hard for him. It emotionally damaged him to kill another person. This clip is 4 minutes long, and I want you to listen to the pace of his breathing and how it changes as he gets closer and closer to describing the manner in which he was forced to take another life. I want you to listen to the number of times that he swallows, and I want you to listen for the static of his beard, because he had this nervous tic, and he started rubbing his beard, I think in a moment when he was feeling either nervous or unwell as he was describing to us what had happened. I should warn you that this clip is graphic, and here we go. So at a certain point, you decide that you want to quit.
Yeah.
Was there one moment or a series of moments?
The second time I did I killed someone. This guy was a drug dealer. I had to stab him in the heart.
Why did you have to do that?
That's his punishment.
And why were you chosen to do this?
I was just about ready to go to riots though. They needed me, and they were kind of preparing me. So I was due to go into that training a couple of weeks from that time.
Yeah.
They just had to vet me one more time.
People were watching?
Yep, including my superiors and other fighters and locals.
Who else was there watching?
There'd be other HISPAs, like, new guys, regular streets people would watch. A lot of kids watch.
How old was he roughly?
I think he's 30-something, in his 30s. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, slight beard, cut face, like square. He was blindfolded. It was like a black leather, rubbery type blindfold. We tied his hands with this wire thing.
Did you mask your face?
Yeah, I did. I masked my face.
Did it help to have that?
Oh yeah. No one could see your face. It helped a lot. They're like, the guy just like talks to the crowd, addresses them, what's about to happen. And I'm just trying to build up the courage to do it. After that, I stabbed him. The blood was warm. And it sprayed everywhere. And the guy was crying and screaming. He did not die after the first time. The second time or so, he probably just slunched over. That was...
How hard is it to put a knife into somebody?
It's hard. I had to stab him multiple times. And then we put him up on a cross. And I had to leave the dagger in his heart. And then there was a sign that said, it had a code on it, and like 166, drugs and alcohol type offense. Yeah.
How did it feel?
It just, at the time, it just felt disgusting but numb at the same time, like gloomy-ish. I just instantly thought, I'm a psycho killer now. Like, what the hell did I just do? That night I couldn't sleep at all. I stayed up all night. I got really sick again. I just kept thinking of the guy. I can still feel having my hand on his shoulder.
On his shoulder?
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah. Holding him. I was pushing him into the knife too. I could still feel that. I could, stabbing someone in the heart like that. I just kept replaying the hand action of my hand going there. I just kept thinking of different things. There was a rush of thoughts in my head. I stabbed him. The blood was just everywhere. What the hell did I just do? I'm a psycho killer now. I didn't give him a chance to repent. I stabbed him. If I die after doing something like this, how will I face God? No. What the hell did I just do? Then I started thinking of my family. What if they were here? What if that had to be my dad? You're basically killing your own parents in a way. Maybe that jihad that I'm doing right now is the wrong type of jihad. Maybe... No, this isn't it. This isn't the right life for me.
Thank you to Unfinished for having me tonight. I'm going to...
Rukmini, thanks very much for that really fascinating talk, slideshow, audio. I mean, it's just it's the full immersion experience. The question, I'm just going to ask you a couple and then open it up, maybe two or three. But the question that you always talk about in your very good podcast, Caliphate, which everyone should listen to, I mean, you'll find it on your podcast lists, is who are they? And this is a question that always puzzles all of us. I just heard you say, talk to this guy who says, he's stabbing someone in the heart, and he even has difficulty doing that, and yet he does it. And I just wondered, what are the motivations? I know it's hard to list them in one response, but what motivates these people?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the thing I've found in all of the years of doing this and all of the people that I've spoken to is that they're not that different from ourselves. They're, especially the fighters who come from the West, they're young people, they're often millennials. Huzaifa talked about the Halloween costumes he used to have. He was into Star Wars, the video games he played, the songs he listened to. He had a very normal upbringing, a loving family, a middle-class family. But what I've noticed in many of them is that there's something missing. It's not often something dramatic. It's not that they're total screw-ups or whatever. In Huzaifa's case, he was an average student, and he came from a Pakistani background with parents who had very high standards. And he somehow didn't find his way in Canada. He didn't get into dental school, which was a setback for him, and he felt like a failure. And at the same time, he found his way into these internet chat rooms where suddenly he had a purpose, where suddenly he had a community, where he was a hero, where he had a role, and he found a purpose there.
I see, and identity, I guess, is a big one, right? It's a big motivation. The other question that I think possibly other people are curious about is ISIS over? Are we to carry on worrying about this thing? Yeah, tell us more.
It's definitely not over. It's not defeated. And I think that at this point, probably most military and army officials have said as much. What has happened is that ISIS has lost the territory that it held. But in fact, ISIS is a new name for al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is a group that emerged in Iraq in 2003-2004. From 2003-2004 until roughly 2013, so for the first decade of its existence, it held almost no land at all, and yet it was incredibly, incredibly deadly. In 2011, when American forces pulled out of Iraq in the drawdown, ISIS, as it was then called the Islamic State of Iraq, was estimated to have less than 1,000 fighters. Now, in the latest Pentagon report from the Pentagon's Inspector General, after the fall of the territorial caliphate, just in Iraq and Syria, they are estimated to have 18,000 fighters. 18 times what they had the last time they were considered defeated. And the last time they were considered defeated was the time before they became what we know them as today.
Because, I mean, I'm wondering, what will Rukmini do if, ISIS and al-Qaeda are no longer around, or they're snuffed out, or they're weakened? I mean, do you think about that?
I don't, but Dean Baquet does. Dean Baquet is the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. He has recently asked me to start looking at white extremism. As it happens, I'm on maternity leave right now. I've just had a small child. And so this is something that I'll be looking at when I get back to work.
Well, that's a little scoop, I guess. Finally, before we turn it over to the audience, I'm from Iran, as it happens, and I was in Iraq in 2003, right after the American invasion. I've lived in Egypt as a child, blah, blah, blah. And yet I don't speak Arabic, and it's one of the great frustrations of my life. And it's an extremely difficult language, as we know, because you learn the literary one, and then, of course, the dialects are different. Yeah. I just wondered, in terms of your own Arabic skills, I mean, I imagine you do speak a little bit, or some, or a lot, or...
I speak very little. I have a vocabulary of very inappropriate Arab words that are words for very bad things that ISIS does. But I rely on talented translators. We have an amazing bureau in Iraq, my colleague Abu Malik, who's become like a brother to me, and those people are constantly with me when I'm doing this work.
Fantastic. So I think it's time to open this up to the audience. Unfortunately, I can't see very well, so I'm going to have to... Do we have any questions here in the hall? Yes, please. We have a lady here. Could I ask you to introduce yourself, if possible?
Yes, of course. I'm Ada. I'm Romanian. Thank you for these stories, which I found mind-blowing. My question is, how are these stories received by the American public? What is your angle in presenting these testimonials from ISIS to your American and Western public? And what is their reaction? Are they well received? Are they put into question? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't completely hear the question. How is it received?
Receive your story.
Receive my stories. It depends on the story. I mean, there's some stories that have been controversial on the subject of write-ups by competing publications, and others that have been well received. But I think that by virtue of the work that I was doing in Mali, I was perhaps a little bit too ahead of the curve. I showed up at the New York Times in 2014, and I knew that ISIS was the next big thing because the al-Qaeda guys that I was talking to in Mali were quitting al-Qaeda to go travel across the desert and the ocean to join ISIS. And it wasn't clear to, I think, the general analyst community and even the military community that ISIS was what it was until I would say probably the beheading of James Foley. Which was in late 2014, and then it wasn't really clear what the danger was for the West until a full year later, 2015, with the Paris attacks. So I sort of felt like I was kind of a Cassandra that was sort of screaming out into the wilderness and was not initially receiving, an audience that was receptive to that. I was even accused of being a warmonger, that somehow my reporting, people think that if you are talking about the terror threat, that you're somehow creating a justification for war. In fact, the two are quite separate. I am trying to report on ISIS, and what people decide to do with that information is up to them.
More questions, please. Yes, we have a gentleman here in the middle of the room with a raised hand. If I could ask you to please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Elvis, and I have one question. Do you think this is hard to be accepted by everyone else, except most likely by authorities, just because ISIS is similar as any other country or organization, government, one without land, but just the same as any other one, which is led by religion in this case, by something powerful that people are looking for, and are willing to do stuff, even killing people, just because they are led there, and it's hard to live after that, seeing from the inside the terror and what they have to do. Every soldier have to kill. Even in our countries, there are people, soldiers who go there, they enroll, but they don't want to kill, and they end up doing that at the end.
Sorry, can you explain, like, what is the question that you would like Rukmini to answer? I mean, because you're making many interesting points, but like, what is the...
The main question is, do you think other countries don't admit ISIS as being an organization, a compact organization because of this thing, because it will be similar like any other organization like government, for example?
Why is it not yeah,
Why is it not recognized
recognized
as a state?
as a state when it's doing all the things that states do,
Right.
you know, soldiers and killing and, you know.
It's not recognized as a state because, of course, it is a terrorist organization, and I think that giving it legitimacy as a state would be seen as something that would help ISIS. But I'll point out to you that the rhetoric that is around ISIS now is very similar to the rhetoric that we heard after 9/11 about the Taliban. And yet, a couple of weeks ago, the Taliban was allegedly invited to Camp David, to the main negotiating table in the United States. So the U.S. has very much gone back and contradicted itself in the treatment of that terror group and is now at the negotiating table with it. I certainly hope that that will not happen with ISIS, but that trajectory is something to look at.
Thank you, Rukmini. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Farah.
And
Thanks.